Now, Judith Browne Dianis, who's Executive Director of the Advancement Project, and Ari Berman, Senior Contributing Writer for The Nation, author of Give Us the Ballot. Judy, let me start with you. I want to play this clip of John McCain because this is important, I think, to note that this idea, which is being explicitly articulated by Trump in a new and novel way, builds on something that's been part of the conservative movement for years. Here's John McCain back in 2008. Take a listen.
We need to know the full extent of Senator Obama's relationship with Acorn, who is now on the verge of maybe perpetrating one of the greatest frauds in voter history in this country, maybe destroying the fabric of democracy.
I mean, that's good old John McCain, you know, everyone celebrates as the sober alternative Trump. This has been something that Republican politicians and movement conservative folks have been talking about for years.
That's right. When all else fails, claim voter fraud. And then when you claim it, don't forget to blame it on black people and of color, especially undocumented immigrants. That's been the playbook for a long time. So Trump finally got around to it and dusted it off. And unfortunately, the courts have gone against him. I mean, we have court after court saying if any rigging is happening, it's Republican legislatures who passed laws to make it harder for people to vote, not for fraud, but in fact because they wanted to discriminate against African American and other voters of color.
And we've got crazy smoking gun evidence of this. In North Carolina, of course, basically, as soon as the key part of the Voting Rights Act gets struck down, the legislature says, what kind of voting tools do people use of different, and the ones that were predominantly African American are like, yeah, let's restrict those.
Absolutely. Well, in North Carolina, for example, where Trump just claimed illegal immigrants were voting falsely, he claimed, we saw a month after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, North Carolina didn't just pass voter ID, but they cut early voting, they eliminated same-day voter registration, they eliminated out-of-precinct voting, they eliminated pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals found that this targeted black voters with, quote, almost surgical precision. And as you mentioned, some of the evidence was as close to a smoking gun as in modern times. Like, for example, North Carolina limited voting on the Sunday before the election, when black churches hold Souls to the Polls voter mobilization drives. And the court asked North Carolina, why did you cut early voting? And North Carolina said, well, some counties were using it more than others. And the court said, well, which counties? And the state of North Carolina said, well, counties that had a larger African-American population intended to vote for Democrats. And the Fourth Circuit said, you just admitted to us in court that you did this to disenfranchise people based on their race and their political affiliation.
And Judy, we now got this crazy situation in which all these states, the Voting Rights Act Section 4, which is sort of defined which areas get preclearance, was gutted, key section. A bunch of states have moved forward on new voting restrictions under Republican stewardship. Many of those have been hung up in court, and we've got this crazy legal terrain in which court after court has said these are not legitimate, and yet they're basically still intact or somewhat still intact. What kind of playing field are we competing on here?
Yeah, it's been a mixed bag. I mean, you know, we have to say as voting rights advocates that we've had a lot of good wins. North Carolina and Texas, where voter ID was struck down. Wisconsin, you know, not so good. And so this is a mixed bag. But at the end of the day, you know, we should not have these laws that are being passed to make it harder to vote for some Americans. You know, I think these courts are starting to understand that this actually is not about voter fraud. In fact, it's not even just about partisan manipulation, but it is about race. There are particular groups of people that they want to go after to make it harder to vote. I mean, you know, Trump's call around voter fraud and now really amping up his base to go into communities and be anti-democracy vigilantes, to come into communities of color to watch people vote. You know, one of the things that those people don't know is that it's actually against the law to intimidate people and while they are trying to vote. And so, you know, we're going to continue to see this, but I think we've been winning, and we've been winning because they have been lying about why they're doing it, and they are the ones who have been rigging the elections.
You know, what Judy just talked about. I mean, Trump has been telling folks, you know, after you vote, go to another precinct to watch it. You know, there's obviously a really nasty history there about, you know, how that's played out in the past.
A very long history. I mean, that's why restricting voting is so dangerous, because we've done it already in this country. We had things like poll taxes and literacy tests and cops patrolling black neighborhoods and preventing people from voting. We've been through this before, so we don't want to go down this road again. And if Trump wanted to talk real voter fraud, the real election rigging, he would talk about the fact that this is the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. He would talk about the fact that this is the first election since the Supreme Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act. But since those are things that Republicans did to try to benefit Republicans, you don't hear about that being the leading threat to American democracy.
Yeah, and I want to be careful about this word rigging, right, because it has a sort of very specific meaning, right, this sort of like intentional, behind-the-scenes manipulation of outcomes. And what we're seeing is a series of hurdles that have been put in place in front of certain populations. And finally, Judy, it strikes me that part of this also is just an expression of the sense that conservatives and Republicans, I think, a lot of them really do believe that they're the majority in this country, and the way they square electoral defeat on a national scope is that there has to be something untoward happening.
That's right. I mean, they conjure up the boogeyman. You know, it's like there's UFOs and boogeyman and the Loch Ness Monster, everything but the fact that maybe your candidate didn't appeal to people. Right. You know, and I just have to take, you know, a little exception to, Chris, what you said. This rigging that is happening by Republican legislatures actually is intentional, and it is meant to make certain people not be able to vote.
Yeah, I just want to be clear about like the difference between pre and post, right? Because I think people have this sense that the valence of the word rigging is that like there's someone in the machines or behind the scenes. These are a series of intentional steps that have been taken to stop certain people from even getting to essentially the ballot box.
They've been very clear about what the intent is here, Chris. I mean, Republicans in Wisconsin said the voter ID law was going to help them win. They, behind closed doors, they said they were giddy about disenfranchising students and people of color. So if there's any kind of rigging, this was preemptively going on.
Judy, Browne, Dianis, and Ari Berman.